"Sir, you need to step away from the bag now." The command cracked through Terminal B at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport sharp enough to turn heads across the security line. Travelers froze mid-step. A toddler stopped crying. Even the rolling wheels of carry-on luggage seemed to slow against the polished floor. Commander Marcus Reed looked up calmly from the black duffel resting near his boots, his expression unreadable beneath the dull glow of the fluorescent ceiling lights. 6'2", broad shoulders, dark hoodie zipped halfway against the cold blast of airport air conditioning. He didn't look dangerous. He looked tired. The kind of tired that settled deep into a man's bones after too many sleepless flights and too many years carrying responsibilities nobody else could see. But Officer Daniel Harlow didn't see exhaustion. He saw a black man standing near gate C-17 with a military-grade case and a silence that somehow irritated him more than shouting ever could. "I said step away from it," Harlow barked again, one hand already resting on the grip of his taser while two other airport officers moved closer. Nearby passengers shifted nervously. Phones slowly lifted into the air. Marcus raised both hands slightly, controlled and steady. "Officer, there's no threat here," he said in a low voice. "Then why's TSA flagging your bag?" Harlow snapped. Marcus glanced once toward the gray reinforced case beside the duffel. The metal corners were scratched from years of travel. A faded military transport sticker clung to one side like an old scar. "Because your scanners detected encrypted hardware," Marcus answered evenly. "Which is exactly what they were supposed to detect." Harlow let out a short laugh that carried more arrogance than humor. "That's supposed to impress me?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Behind him, rain streaked against the giant terminal windows in crooked silver lines, while thunder rolled faintly beyond the runways. Flights were already delayed across half the East Coast. The airport felt packed tighter than usual, hot coffee smells mixing with wet jackets and the hum of irritated travelers. "Open the case," Harlow demanded. Marcus' eyes hardened for the first time. Not angry, not afraid, just firm. "You do not have clearance to access that equipment." That sentence changed the atmosphere instantly. The officers exchanged glances. A woman near the Starbucks counter whispered something under her breath. Harlow took a slow step forward, his jaw tightening. "You federal?" Marcus remained still. "I'm asking you one last time to contact Pentagon verification before this goes any further." Harlow smirked openly now. "Pentagon." One of the younger officers chuckled under his breath. "You hear this guy?" Marcus lowered his hand slowly. "My name is Commander Marcus Reed, United States Navy." "Sure it is," Harlow replied. "And I'm the president." A few uncomfortable laughs escaped from the crowd, but most people stayed silent. There was something about Marcus that made the room uneasy. Not because he looked threatening, because he looked controlled, disciplined, like a man who had already measured the outcome of this situation long before anyone else realized they were standing inside it. Harlow moved closer until they were only inches apart. "You people always think flashing some story gets you special treatment." Marcus stared directly at him, rainwater reflecting faintly in his dark eyes from the storm outside. "No, officer," he said quietly. "I think following protocol keeps people safe." For half a second, neither man moved. Then Harlow grabbed Marcus by the arm and pulled him away from the bag hard enough to send gasps through the terminal. Phones rose higher. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Marcus didn't resist, didn't raise his voice, didn't even tense his shoulders. He simply looked down once at the officer's hand gripping his sleeve before lifting his eyes back to Harlow's face. And when he spoke again, his voice was calm enough to chill the air around them. "You are making the biggest mistake of your career." The cold metal bench inside airport security holding room 3 creaked softly as Marcus Reed sat down without resistance. Outside the narrow reinforced window, the storm darkened the Atlanta skyline until the entire terminal looked trapped beneath layers of gray clouds and flashing runway lights. Officer Daniel Harlow removed the handcuffs with visible annoyance, as if Marcus' calmness irritated him more than an actual struggle would have. "Do not move," he ordered. Marcus simply nodded once. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a low electrical hum that reminded Marcus of old military transport planes crossing the Atlantic at 3 in the morning. He folded his hands together slowly and stared at the scratched steel table in front of him while voices echoed outside the door. "You really think this guy is military?" One officer whispered. "Man, look at him," another replied quietly. Marcus heard every word but showed no reaction. He had spent most of his life learning how to disappear inside silence. Detroit had taught him that first, long before the medals, long before classified missions and Pentagon briefings. Back when he was 12 years old, sharing a one-bedroom apartment with his younger brother on the east side of the city, where sirens replaced lullabies almost every night. His father, Isaiah Reed, had served in the Marine Corps before spending 20 years driving city buses through neighborhoods most politicians only mentioned during election seasons. His mother worked overnight shifts at Henry Ford Hospital until arthritis twisted her fingers so badly she could barely hold a coffee mug by the time Marcus graduated high school. They raised him on discipline instead of comfort, respect instead of excuses. Stay calm even when the world wants you angry, his father used to say while polishing old combat boots at the kitchen table. Marcus carried those words into every part of his life. Into basic underwater demolition training. Into freezing Pacific water during Hell Week. Into operations overseas nobody outside classified briefings would ever hear about. He remembered instructors doubting him before he ever opened his mouth. Remembered the subtle looks. The assumptions. Too quiet. Too big. Too black. Some men reacted to pressure by getting louder. Marcus became still. Stillness unsettled people more. Especially men like Daniel Harlow. Through the small window in the door, Marcus watched officers move quickly across the terminal hallway. Travelers continued filming with their phones. A little girl wearing a pink raincoat stared toward the holding room while her mother gently guided her away. Somewhere beyond the walls, an airport announcement echoed overhead about delayed departures to Washington and Dallas. Life continued moving while his remained temporarily frozen inside 12 feet of concrete and fluorescent light. The door opened suddenly. Harlow stepped back inside carrying a printed file folder. "Funny thing," he said while tossing the papers onto the table. "Your records barely exist." Marcus glanced down calmly. "That is usually how classified service works." Harlow smirked. "Or maybe you are just good at pretending." Marcus leaned back slightly, exhaustion heavy behind his eyes now. 20 hours without sleep. 2 flights. 1 encrypted transport assignment he had been ordered to complete before sunrise. "Officer," he said quietly, "there are procedures for situations like this. And there are procedures for suspicious behavior in airports." Harlow shot back. Marcus looked directly at him for several long seconds. Not challenging him. Measuring him. Reading him the same way he had learned to read unstable situations overseas. The same way he could tell within moments that this was no longer about security. It was about pride. Harlow wanted to be right now. Needed to be right. And men who needed power too badly usually made dangerous decisions. Rain hammered harder against the terminal windows outside. Then Marcus finally spoke again, his voice low enough to almost disappear beneath the thunder. "You still have time to fix this before people much higher than both of us get involved." Daniel Harlow hated being questioned in front of other officers. The feeling crawled beneath his skin like heat trapped under a uniform collar, slow and irritating, and Marcus Reed's calm voice was making it worse with every passing minute. Outside holding room 3, the terminal had become louder despite the storm. Delayed passengers crowded near charging stations and restaurant counters, while rolling thunder rattled the giant. Glass walls overlooking the runway. Blue and white reflections from airport security vehicles flashed across the wet tarmac outside like restless ghosts. Harlow stood near the steel door watching Marcus through the narrow window for several silent seconds before turning toward Officer Kevin Ellis, the youngest member of the airport police unit. "Run facial recognition again," Harlow ordered. Kevin hesitated. "Sir, I already did twice." His military identification number matches Department of Defense formatting. Harlow's jaw tightened. "Formatting is not confirmation." Kevin lowered his voice carefully. "Sir, maybe we should call the verification line he mentioned." Harlow looked at him sharply. "You trying to tell me how to do my job?" "No, sir." "Then stop acting nervous." Kevin nodded quickly, though his eyes drifted back toward the holding room. Something about Marcus unsettled him too, but not in the same way. Marcus did not look like a criminal. He looked like somebody carrying the weight of things nobody else in the terminal could understand. Inside the room, Marcus sat perfectly still beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting, elbows resting lightly against the table while rainwater continued sliding down the narrow window behind him. His dark hoodie was still damp near the shoulders from walking across the loading area before the confrontation began. On the table beside him sat his watch, wallet, and military identification card sealed inside a plastic evidence pouch. Harlow stepped back inside, carrying the reinforced black case from the checkpoint. The metal latches clicked softly as he placed it on the table between them. "Last chance," Marcus said quietly. "Do not open that case without federal authorization." Harlow leaned forward slightly. "You know what I think?" Marcus remained silent. "I think you enjoy this." Harlow's voice carried a cold confidence now, the kind built over years of believing authority automatically made him right. "Guys like you walk in here acting important, throwing around military words, hoping people back off." Marcus' eyes never left him. "Guys like me." Harlow folded his arms. "You know exactly what I mean." For a moment, the room fell completely silent except for distant airport announcements echoing faintly through the walls. Kevin shifted uncomfortably near the doorway. Even he knew the conversation had crossed into dangerous territory now. Marcus finally leaned back slightly in the chair. His voice stayed level. "You decided who I was before I ever spoke." Harlow scoffed. "I decided you were suspicious." "No," Marcus answered softly. "You decided I did not belong." The words hung in the air heavier than the storm outside. Harlow immediately grabbed the latch on the reinforced case and forced it open. Kevin stepped forward instinctively. "Sir, maybe we should wait for clearance." Harlow ignored him. The lid lifted slowly, revealing layers of dense black foam and several secured electronic drives marked with bright red Department of Defense classification labels. Beneath them sat encrypted communication equipment unlike anything Kevin had seen outside military documentaries. Small green indicator lights blinked steadily against matte black surfaces, while an embossed silver seal stamped into the interior foam read "Restricted Transport Authorization." Kevin's face lost color almost instantly. "Sir." Harlow stared down at the contents, though the confidence in his posture faded slightly for the first time. Marcus watched him carefully. "You just violated federal containment protocol inside the busiest airport in the country," he said quietly. Harlow looked back up fast, pride battling uncertainty behind his eyes. It could still all be fake. Marcus slowly exhaled through his nose, exhaustion visible now beneath his controlled expression. Then he slid his gaze toward the old wall clock above the steel door. "No," he said softly. "If that equipment stops transmitting for much longer, people are going to start looking for me." The digital clock above holding room 3 changed from 8:42 to 8:43 p.m., and somehow the air inside the airport felt tighter after that. Officer Kevin Ellis could feel it in the silence spreading through the hallway outside the security office. Even the constant airport noise seemed different now, quieter somehow, as if the building itself was waiting for something. Rain continued hammering against the massive terminal windows while lightning flashed across the runway every few minutes, flooding the polished floors with cold white light. Inside the holding room, Marcus Reed remained seated with both hands folded loosely in front of him, his posture calm despite the classified equipment sitting exposed on the steel table between him and Daniel Harlow. The blinking green lights on the encrypted devices reflected faintly across Marcus' dark eyes. Harlow tried to maintain control of the room, but the certainty he carried earlier had started slipping around the edges. Kevin noticed it immediately. The older officer kept shifting his jaw now, kept glancing at the open case like he wanted it closed again, but was too proud to admit it. "Sir," Kevin said carefully from near the doorway, "those markings are real Department of Defense classification labels." Harlow did not look at him. "Anybody can print labels." Marcus finally spoke again, his voice steady and almost tired. "The transmitter inside that case checks in every 15 minutes. Harlow crossed his arms. And it already missed one verification ping while you had me detained at the checkpoint." Kevin swallowed hard. Marcus looked toward the rain-streaked window behind Harlow before continuing. "The second missed ping automatically escalates to military oversight." Harlow forced out a dry laugh. "You expect me to believe the Pentagon tracks one guy that closely?" Marcus slowly turned his attention back toward him. "Not me," he answered quietly. "The data." That sentence landed differently. Kevin felt it immediately. The room seemed colder after Marcus said it. One of the communication devices inside the case suddenly emitted a soft electronic tone before a tiny amber warning light began blinking near the center panel. Kevin took an unconscious step backward. "Sir," Harlow immediately slammed the lid halfway shut. "Turn that thing off." Marcus did not move. "I cannot." "You expect me to believe you cannot shut down your own equipment?" Marcus' expression never changed. "I was ordered to transport it, not access it." Outside the room, airport staff moved. "Faster now." Kevin could hear radios crackling down the corridor while TSA supervisors whispered near the security desk. News of the classified equipment was spreading. Travelers nearby kept staring toward the hallway with nervous curiosity while cell phones continued recording from a distance. Harlow rubbed one hand across his face before pointing toward Marcus again. "You are still being detained until I know exactly who you are." Marcus nodded once. "Then call the verification number inside my wallet." Harlow hesitated. Marcus could see the conflict happening behind his eyes now. Pride fighting fear. Ego fighting protocol. Men like Daniel Harlow built entire careers around believing instinct mattered more than humility. And humility was exactly what this moment required. "You really think somebody important is coming for you?" Harlow asked finally. Marcus leaned back slightly in the chair, exhaustion weighing heavily across his shoulders now. "No," he answered softly. "I think they are already on their way." As if the universe itself wanted to prove him right, every radio in the hallway suddenly crackled alive at once. "Attention all airport units," a tense voice announced through static. "We have incoming federal coordination requests connected to security incident Charlie 7. Repeat, federal coordination in progress." Kevin's eyes widened. Harlow went completely still. Marcus lowered his gaze briefly toward the blinking amber light inside the partially open case before speaking one final time. "Quiet. Controlled. Certain." That was the second missed ping. The atmosphere inside Terminal B shifted from tense to surreal in less than 60 seconds. Officers who had been standing casually near the security desk moments earlier were suddenly speaking into radios with stiff shoulders and lowered voices, while TSA supervisors hurried across the polished floor carrying tablets and printed reports. Beyond the giant rain-covered windows, blue emergency lights reflected off the runway like flashes from another world. Travelers stopped pretending not to watch. Entire clusters of passengers stood frozen near charging stations and airport restaurants staring toward the restricted hallway leading to holding room 3. Some still held phones in the air recording. Others simply watched in silence, sensing something far bigger than a normal airport incident unfolding right in front of them. Inside the holding room, Marcus Reed remained seated exactly where he had been for nearly 40 minutes. Calm. Motionless. The amber warning light inside the open military case continued blinking steadily against the dark foam interior while soft electronic tones pulsed every few seconds. Daniel Harlow stared at the equipment like it had personally betrayed him. Sweat had begun collecting beneath the collar of his uniform despite the cold air conditioning circulating through the room. Officer Kevin Ellis stepped closer to the doorway after another urgent transmission crackled through his radio. "Sir," he said carefully, "airport operations just confirmed federal agencies are requesting direct access to the terminal." Harlow snapped his head toward him. "Which agencies?" Kevin swallowed once. "Department of Defense Coordination. Homeland Security. Possibly NCIS." The room went silent again. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly toward the steel table before speaking in the same measured tone he had used since the beginning. "I told you the system would escalate." Harlow pointed toward him immediately. "You do not get to act superior right now." Marcus looked back up slowly. "This stopped being about me a long time ago." Those words landed harder than Harlow expected. Because deep down, he knew Marcus was right. The moment he ignored protocol and opened classified federal equipment inside a civilian airport, the situation had moved beyond personal authority. And now the consequences were moving toward him fast. Outside the room, a TSA administrator named Linda Carver appeared near the hallway entrance holding a tablet tightly against her chest. Mid-50s, silver glasses, sharp posture. The kind of woman who had spent 20 years cleaning up other people's mistakes. She looked through the narrow window into holding room 3 and immediately noticed the exposed military hardware on the table. Her expression changed instantly. "Officer Harlow," she said firmly after stepping inside. "Why is restricted equipment open?" Harlow straightened defensively. "We are conducting an investigation." Linda looked directly at Marcus. "Sir, were you transporting under federal authorization?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." "Destination?" "Washington Navy Yard." Linda's face tightened. She turned slowly back toward Harlow. "Do you understand what kind of clearance is required for this level of transport?" Harlow tried to hold his ground. The suspect refused to cooperate. Marcus finally spoke again. Quiet. Controlled. "I asked for verification 5 separate times." Linda looked at Kevin. "Is that true?" Kevin hesitated only a second. "Yes, ma'am." Harlow's jaw flexed hard enough to show through the skin near his temple. Outside the terminal windows, another flash of lightning lit the runway bright white for an instant. Then came the thunder, low and heavy enough to vibrate faintly through the walls. Marcus glanced toward the blinking amber light again. "How long before that becomes a problem?" Kevin asked nervously. Marcus checked the wall clock above the door. "About 6 minutes." Harlow folded his arms tightly. "What happens in 6 minutes?" Marcus met his eyes without the slightest trace of fear. "People with much more authority than you arrive asking very difficult questions." As if summoned by the sentence itself, the distant roar of engines suddenly echoed from outside the terminal. Not commercial aircraft. Ground vehicles. Multiple. Fast. Linda moved toward the hallway window and looked out across the rain-soaked tarmac. Her face drained of color almost immediately. Black SUVs were already crossing the restricted runway access road straight toward the terminal entrance. Rainwater streamed down the towering terminal windows in silver rivers as the black SUVs rolled across the restricted airport roadway and stopped hard outside the security entrance. Their headlights cut through the storm like white blades across wet concrete. Nobody inside Terminal B spoke loudly anymore. The energy had changed completely. Travelers who had once watched out of curiosity now stood frozen with tense faces and lowered voices, instinctively sensing they were witnessing the collapse of something important. Inside holding room 3, the fluorescent lights hummed softly above Marcus Reed, while the amber warning light inside the military case continued its steady pulse. Blink. Pause. Blink. Each flash reflected faintly across the steel table, and the polished badge clipped to Daniel Harlow's chest. Harlow no longer looked angry. He looked cornered. Linda Carver stood near the doorway gripping her tablet tightly, while Officer Kevin Ellis watched the hallway through the narrow window. 3 vehicles, Kevin whispered quietly. No airport markings. Marcus remained seated without moving. His breathing stayed calm, controlled, almost detached from the panic slowly building around him. Harlow stared toward the window. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. Marcus finally lifted his eyes toward him. "No," he answered quietly. "This is procedure." Thunder rolled across the runway again, low and heavy enough to vibrate through the floor beneath their feet. Somewhere farther inside the terminal, a child began crying before being hushed by a nervous parent. The airport announcements overhead continued repeating delayed departure information in a cheerful voice that now sounded strangely disconnected from reality. Then came the sound of footsteps. Not rushed, not chaotic, precise. Multiple pairs moving down the hallway in complete synchronization. Kevin stepped back from the door instinctively. Linda's face tightened. Harlow swallowed hard enough for Marcus to notice. The footsteps stopped directly outside the room. Silence followed. 1 second. 2. Then the steel door opened. 3 men entered first, wearing dark federal jackets still damp from the rain outside. Behind them walked a tall African-American man in a charcoal overcoat with silver hair cut close to the scalp and the posture of someone accustomed to command rooms where entire governments listened when he spoke. The moment Marcus saw him, he stood immediately for the first time since entering the holding room. "Admiral Bennett," Marcus said calmly. Every officer in the room went still. Daniel Harlow's face drained almost instantly. Rear Admiral Curtis Bennett glanced once toward the open military case on the table before slowly turning his attention toward Marcus. "Commander Reed," he said in a controlled voice, "report." Marcus answered without hesitation. "Transport interrupted at checkpoint approximately 52 minutes ago. Classified equipment opened without authorization. Verification requests denied repeatedly." Bennett's jaw tightened slightly with every sentence. He turned toward Harlow next. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Which officer authorized the opening of federally restricted containment equipment? Nobody answered immediately. Rain hammered harder against the terminal windows behind them. Kevin looked at the floor. Linda closed her eyes briefly. Harlow finally forced himself to step forward. Sir, I was conducting a security investigation. Bennett stared at him for several long seconds. Not loud, not emotional. Somehow that made it worse. Security investigation, he repeated quietly. On an active Navy SEAL courier operating under Department of Defense clearance. Harlow opened his mouth, but no words came out. Bennett stepped closer to the steel table and looked down at the blinking amber light still flashing inside the open case. Do you understand, he asked calmly, that this equipment was connected to a live national security operation? The silence after that sentence felt suffocating. Marcus stood quietly near the wall now, hands folded behind his back, his face unreadable beneath the cold fluorescent lights. He did not look triumphant. He looked tired, deeply tired, like a man who had spent years serving a country that still sometimes looked at his skin before it looked at his uniform. Bennett finally turned back toward him. Commander, he said quietly, you should never have been treated this way. Marcus held the Admiral's gaze for a moment before answering in the same calm voice he had carried all night. With respect, sir, he said softly. Men like me usually are. No one inside holding room 3 seemed to breathe after Marcus Reed spoke those words. The storm outside continued pounding against the terminal windows, but inside the room, the silence carried far more weight than thunder ever could. Rear Admiral Curtis Bennett stood motionless beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, while airport officers avoided eye contact one by one. The blinking amber light inside the classified transport case reflected faintly across the Admiral's polished black shoes. Daniel Harlow looked like a man watching his entire career collapse in slow motion. For the first time that night, he no longer appeared defensive. He appeared afraid. Bennett finally turned away from Marcus and faced the officers directly. Everyone except Commander Reed and federal personnel leave the room, he ordered calmly. The authority in his voice was immediate and absolute. Linda Carver nodded first and stepped toward the hallway without argument. Kevin Ellis followed quietly after her, though he glanced back once toward Marcus before leaving. Harlow remained frozen near the table. Bennett looked at him sharply. That includes you, officer. Harlow swallowed hard. Sir, I was only trying to protect the airport. Bennett's expression did not change. By ignoring federal verification procedures? Harlow opened his mouth again, but stopped when Bennett stepped closer. Do you know where Commander Reed has been the last 72 hours? Harlow said nothing. Poland, Turkey, then Virginia. Bennett's voice stayed low and controlled. 3 countries, 2 classified briefings, 1 active operation connected to a credible international threat. Harlow's face slowly lost what little color remained. Bennett gestured toward the open case. That equipment was carrying encrypted intelligence scheduled for direct transfer tonight. Marcus stood quietly near the wall, shoulders heavy with exhaustion, while federal agents carefully inspected the communication devices on the table. He had not interrupted once, had not defended himself beyond the truth. The Admiral glanced toward him briefly before continuing. Every minute Commander Reed was detained forced analysts in Washington to assume a possible breach scenario. Harlow's breathing became shallow. I did not know. Bennett looked directly into his eyes. That is exactly why protocol exists. Outside the room, terminal crowds continued gathering near the restricted hallway despite airport staff trying to move them away. News was already spreading through social media. Videos of Marcus being detained had begun circulating online. Travelers whispered nervously while rainwater streaked endlessly down the giant windows overlooking the runway. A young black boy standing near the food court stared toward the hallway with wide eyes while his father rested a hand gently on his shoulder. Back inside the room, one of the federal agents approached Bennett quietly and handed him a tablet. Bennett scanned the screen for several seconds before looking toward Harlow again. Airport surveillance confirms Commander Reed requested federal verification 5 separate times before detention. Harlow lowered his eyes to the floor. Yes, sir. And yet you continued escalating the situation. Harlow did not answer. Because there was nothing left to say. Bennett stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. You saw a black man with military equipment and decided your assumptions mattered more than procedure. The words landed with brutal precision. Not shouted. Not emotional. Just undeniable. Marcus closed his eyes briefly for one tired second before looking toward the rain-covered window again. He had lived versions of this moment his entire life. Different uniforms. Different cities. Same assumptions. Bennett noticed the expression crossing Marcus' face, and something in his own posture softened slightly. "Commander," he said quietly, "Washington authorized immediate continuation of your mission." Marcus nodded once. "Understood, sir." Bennett hesitated before speaking again. "There will also be a formal investigation into tonight's conduct." Marcus looked at him calmly. "Respectfully, sir, investigations only matter if people learn from them." The admiral studied him carefully for a moment. Here stood a man publicly humiliated, delayed during a national security assignment, treated like a threat in front of hundreds of strangers, and still speaking with restraint instead of bitterness. Bennett finally gave a slow nod filled with something close to shame. "That is probably why you were trusted with this mission in the first place." Marcus said nothing. Outside the terminal windows, lightning flashed once more across the runway, while the amber warning light inside the case finally turned green again. By the time the storm finally began weakening over Atlanta, the atmosphere inside Terminal B had transformed completely. The tension that once filled the security corridor had been replaced by something heavier. Shame. Airport employees moved carefully now, speaking in lowered voices while federal agents continued securing the hallway around Holding Room 3. Travelers who had recorded the confrontation earlier still lingered near the terminal entrances, watching quietly as pieces of the truth spread from phone to phone across the airport. Marcus Reed stood near the steel table while a federal technician resealed the classified equipment inside the reinforced transport case. The green status light blinked steadily now, calm and stable beneath the dark foam lining. Marcus rolled his shoulders once, exhaustion visible in every movement. He had not slept in nearly a full day. The lines beneath his eyes looked deeper under the fluorescent lights, and the damp fabric of his hoodie still clung faintly to his back from the rain earlier that evening. Rear Admiral Curtis Bennett finished signing several federal authorization forms before stepping toward him again. "Your transport to Washington is ready," he said quietly. Marcus nodded once. Then his eyes shifted toward the hallway outside the room, where Daniel Harlow stood alone near the security desk. No badge confidence anymore. No arrogance. Just a man staring blankly at the polished airport floor, while internal affairs officers quietly spoke with airport administration nearby. Kevin Ellis stood several feet away holding his cap in both hands, visibly shaken by everything that had unfolded. Marcus watched them silently for a moment before reaching for his duffel bag. Bennett noticed his expression. "You are not responsible for what happened here tonight," the Admiral said. Marcus slid the strap over his shoulder slowly. "Maybe not," he answered softly. "But this kind of thing keeps happening because nobody ever really talks about it after." Bennett did not respond immediately, because he knew Marcus was right. The room fell quiet again except for distant airport announcements echoing through the terminal and the soft tapping of rain against the giant windows outside. Then Marcus did something none of them expected. He walked toward the doorway. Federal agents instinctively moved aside as he stepped into the hallway. Conversation stopped immediately. Harlow looked up slowly when Marcus approached him. The older officer looked exhausted now too, though in a very different way. The weight of consequences had finally settled onto his shoulders. "Commander Reed," Harlow began, his voice rough and uncertain. Marcus stopped a few feet away. Harlow swallowed hard before speaking again. "I made assumptions about you." Marcus held his gaze calmly. "Yes," he answered. Harlow looked down briefly. "I thought I was doing my job." Marcus nodded slightly. "That is the dangerous part." Harlow frowned faintly. Marcus continued quietly. "People rarely believe they are wrong while they are doing it." The hallway remained completely silent around them. Travelers nearby watched openly now. So did airport staff. Kevin Ellis lowered his eyes for a moment, clearly embarrassed by the entire situation. Harlow finally forced himself to speak again. "I am sorry." Marcus studied him carefully. The apology sounded genuine. Small. Human. But also late. "Officer," Marcus said softly, "an apology matters more when it changes how you see people after tonight." Harlow's face tightened with emotion he clearly did not know how to process. Marcus adjusted the strap on his duffel bag and glanced briefly toward Kevin next. "You wanted to follow protocol," he said. Kevin nodded immediately. Yes, sir. Do not lose that instinct just because somebody louder outranks you. Kevin's throat tightened slightly. I will not, sir. Marcus gave a small nod before finally turning toward the terminal exit, where federal escorts waited near the black SUVs outside. As he walked away, nobody tried stopping him this time. Nobody questioned him. Travelers moved aside quietly, creating a clear path through the crowded terminal. And for the first time that night, Daniel Harlow understood something painful standing there beneath the cold airport lights. The strongest man in the building had been the one who never once raised his voice. The storm had almost completely passed by the time Marcus Reed stepped onto the rain-darkened tarmac beneath the floodlights outside Terminal B. The cold night air smelled like jet fuel, wet concrete, and the faint electricity left behind after lightning storms. Behind him, the massive airport still glowed through sheets of water sliding down the giant glass walls, but the chaos inside had finally quieted. The black SUVs waited nearby with engines humming softly, while federal personnel moved with calm efficiency around the secured transport case. Somewhere beyond the runway, a commercial jet lifted into the clouds, its engines rumbling low across the night sky. Marcus paused beside the vehicle for just a moment and looked back toward the terminal entrance. Through the glass, he could still see silhouettes moving inside the brightly lit building. Travelers returning to delayed flights. Employees cleaning up another long night. Security officers speaking quietly beneath fluorescent lights. Life continuing forward like it always did. Rear Admiral Curtis Bennett stepped beside him, coat collar raised against the cold wind. Washington already started damage control, he said quietly. Marcus gave a tired half-smile. For the operation or the headlines? Bennett exhaled softly. Both. Marcus looked down briefly at the faded military patch stitched near the strap of his duffel bag. The edges were worn now from years of deployments and flights through places most Americans only saw on television. Iraq, Afghanistan, Eastern Europe. Places where nobody questioned whether he belonged in uniform because survival mattered more than assumptions. You know, Bennett said carefully, videos from inside the terminal are already everywhere online. Marcus nodded once. I figured. People are angry. Marcus looked back toward the airport windows again. They should be. Bennett studied him for a moment before speaking more quietly. Most men would be furious after tonight. Marcus remained silent for several seconds while cold wind swept rainwater across the concrete around their boots. Then he finally answered. Being angry all the time gets exhausting. Bennett lowered his eyes briefly. Marcus continued softly. My father spent 30 years telling me that dignity is not something people hand you. It is something you carry even when others refuse to see it. The Admiral gave a slow nod. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply stood there beneath the floodlights listening to the distant sound of aircraft engines and rain dripping steadily from the terminal roof. Then the side doors near the security entrance opened again. Officer Kevin Ellis stepped outside cautiously into the cold night air. He looked nervous approaching Marcus now, like someone unsure whether he even deserved to speak. Marcus turned toward him calmly. Kevin stopped a few feet away. Commander Reed, he said quietly. I just wanted to say thank you. Marcus frowned slightly. For what? Kevin glanced back toward the terminal behind him. For showing restraint tonight. The words hung in the air between them. Marcus looked at the young officer for a long moment before answering. Restraint is easy when you know who you are. Kevin nodded slowly, clearly carrying that sentence somewhere deep inside himself already. Marcus adjusted the strap on his duffel bag one final time before federal agents loaded the reinforced transport case into the waiting SUV. As he moved toward the open vehicle door, a small voice suddenly called out from behind the terminal glass. Sir. Marcus turned slightly. The young black boy from the food court stood inside near the window now, one small hand pressed against the glass, while his father stood quietly beside him. The boy lifted his hand into a nervous salute. Marcus looked at him for one still second beneath the airport floodlights. Then, slowly and respectfully, he returned the salute. The boy's face lit up instantly. No speeches followed. No dramatic music. Just the sound of rainwater dripping from the terminal roof and jet engines humming somewhere beyond the dark runway, while Marcus Reed climbed into the waiting vehicle and disappeared into the night, carrying both the weight of his country and the quiet dignity it had almost failed to recognize.